Hello and welcome to week 3 of Social Distancing. Today is the 3rd of April and the music that we're looking at today is for this coming Sunday, which is Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday for me I find very intense because it encompasses so much. In terms of the Easter narrative, it's about Jesus arriving into Jerusalem and being greeted by the crowds and them shouting hosannas and waving palms, hence the name. But later on in the Palm Sunday service, we also hear the entire Passion narrative from the Last Supper through to the crucifixion. So it's really sort of a preface to everything that is to come during Holy Week, which is a very emotional time, and there's diverse moods and themes that are going to be looked at in more detail later on during the week. And musically, for looking at such a broad range of emotions, I think one of the best places to go is the Psalms. The Psalms deal so much with the entire range of the human existence and how it feels to go through life. There's just so much variety and contrast of mood between different psalms, and you get an entire range of emotion being expressed through them. The psalm I'm looking at in this video is the psalm set for the Liturgy of the Palms on Palm Sunday, which encompasses a lot of different things and also starts to foreshadow Easter and the joy of the resurrection. Because this is a psalm rather than a hymn, this is going to be structured a little differently to the last couple of videos, and I'm going to start just with a sort of brief explanation of how Anglican chant psalm singing works, talking through sort of what it is, how it's notated and so on. If you're already really experienced with singing Anglican chant psalms, you can skip this portion of the video, that's absolutely fine. But if you're a little less confident, then the following is just a brief explanation of how it works, and we'll go into more detail as we go through later on in the video. So Anglican chant, as a way of singing psalms and other canticles and so on, evolves from medieval plain chant, and both of these are designed to overcome the challenge that the psalms are unmetered. There's a different number and different structure of syllables in each verse. So the way Anglican chant gets around this is taking a simple harmonised melody. It's 14 bars long and split into 2 halves. Within each half there are 2 quarters, and each quarter is used for half a verse of a psalm. So the chant sung through represents 2 verses of the psalm. The first note of each quarter is a reciting note, and the majority of syllables within the psalm are sung to reciting notes, especially when you have very long verses. Vertical lines in the text represent bar lines in the music, and the red diamond at the halfway point of the verse represents the double bar line in the middle of the half. In bars with minims in general we sing these 1 syllable per note unless it's otherwise indicated in some way, and then any remaining syllables are sung to the semibreve in the last bar of each quarter. So the first thing to do is to learn the notes for the chant that we're going to use, and the way that we usually do this is to sing the chant rhythmically, but to numbers rather than words. So we're going to use the numbers 1 to 10, which takes us to the halfway point in the chant, and then back down. So I'm going to sing through the melody first with the piano, and then, as I've done with previous videos, start building up the harmony from the bass up to the tenor and then the alto, and just with a few little comments on each one as we go through. As usual, don't forget to warm up before you sing. No new exercises today, I'm just going to refer you back to the posture exercises from the first video and the vocal warm-ups from the second video, and then once you've had a revisit of those, come back here and we'll start learning the chant together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that's the melody. Nothing too complicated in there. Be careful at the end of the first half of the chant not to sink too far down, coming down from here to here. Keep it nice and bright, otherwise fairly straightforward. Let's move on and look at the bass part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7. So a slightly tricky moment there just comes at the end of the chant, going down a seventh from the F down to the G. What could be helpful here is actually to imagine the G just rising up from the F and then go down the octave. So you can practice it a few times as 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, just to try and help work out where that G down there is, because it's easier to pitch it as an octave rather than a seventh, I often find. So try that a few times. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then once you're comfortable with where that low G is, you can go straight through 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So now let's look at the tenor part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So there in the tenor part, it's important just at the end to make sure that the last note is not too low. As I was saying, with the melody line halfway through the chant, not to drop too low down to it. 3, 2, 1, because it's the major third in the chord, so it needs to be nice and bright. So let's move on now to the alto part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So there's just a couple of moments in there where the alto part repeats a note, but the soprano part moves to clash with it. So for example, at the start of the second quarter and the start of the third quarter as well. So if you're singing the alto part, just lean into those slightly. So now let's have a listen to all of the parts together. And as I've done before, I'm going to play the melody part up an octave on the piano so you can hear it really clearly, and the other parts sung together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So, because musically the chant is quite straightforward, most of what we do when we're rehearsing a psalm is to think about the text and how we interpret it and how we narrate it, and what that means for how we approach it as singers. In psalms, it's the text that is the most important thing to convey when we're singing, and the meaning of the text is going to be reflected by how we approach the singing of it. So what we're going to do now is just look through the verses on this page, and I'm going to give some direction about how we're going to go about singing it. So starting at the very beginning, we're going to be quite loud in these first couple of verses. It's a very strong opening to the psalm, so we want to reflect that with a nice broad forte sound. The comma in the first verse after the word Lord, there's lots of ways we can indicate commas. One of the ways obviously is to take a breath and actually separate the two halves of the phrase. But another way, and a way that I think is quite effective here, is just to lengthen the word before the comma and make it a little bit longer. This puts a natural pause into the speech rhythm of what we're doing, which indicates that there is some punctuation there. We won't always do that, but that's what we're going to do in this case. As we come to the changing notes, it's important to try and maintain the speech rhythm. When we sing psalms, we should aim to pronounce the words as though we were sort of speaking them very carefully and considerately, and not to let what we view as the rhythm of the notes on page affect the rhythm of the words. We want to observe the rhythm of the natural way of speaking this carefully and slowly, but still in a way that puts the text first. In the second half of this first verse, you'll notice that in the second bar, we've got 2 notes, but 3 syllables. The dot in between mercy and the first half of endures tells us where to change note. So mercy is on the first note, and then the N is on the second note. A note on pronunciation as well. One of my personal preferences for pronouncing words like endures when we sing is to try and remove any extraneous consonant and produce the sound with a diphthong in the vowel rather than adding a consonant in. It's the difference between endures with a d and endures with a j. Similarly, in verse 19, righteous rather than righteous. From verse 3 onwards, we'll bring the dynamics down a little bit to a sort of mezzo forte sound. We don't want to be overexerting ourselves and sustaining a forte throughout. A few other commas to watch out for. Verse 21, for example, lengthening the word you before the comma there. As we come to verse 23 and 24, let's have those verses back up to the forte sound that we had at the beginning. And in verse 23, notice in the second bar there that the hyphen within the word marvellous is performing the same function as a dot in the other verses. It's a hyphen because it's still just one word, but it's showing you that marvel is on the first note and us on the second note. Finally, let's sing verse 24 in unison. Verse 24 is the anticipation of Easter within this psalm. The text of that is often used as an Easter anthem, and so we want to be nice and strong and joyful there. Now, obviously, I've thrown a lot of information at you very quickly, and to remember it all would be impossible. So what I'm going to do now is show you how I would mark up my copy of this if I had just been given all of those instructions. So now on the screen you see a slightly annotated version of the pretty bare bone score that I gave you to start with. You've got dynamic markings and similar directions on the left hand side there, a few pronunciation notes along the right, and I've also underlined some of the syllables that we're going to be lengthening in order to indicate a comma. The eagle-eyed among you may have spotted that at the top the heading says Psalm 118 verses 1 and 2, 19 to 29, and the current score on your screen stops at verse 24. And the final direction that I've made a note of for myself is to turn over the page, because on the second page not only does the psalm continue, but there's a change of chant. It's going to be played over before we sing it in the performance, but we also need to be ready for that. So what we're going to do now is look at that second chant and learn it in the same way that we did the first chant, with numbers going 1 to 10 and back down, starting with the melody line, then the bass, tenor and alto parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 and 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, reasonably straightforward here. Make sure that in the second quarter, as you go up to the high note, you sort of get right on top of it. Don't be sort of straining up at it from below. Just watch out as well at the start of the third quarter for the C natural. There was C sharp just a couple of bars before, but back to C natural at the start of the second half. So let's build up the harmony now, starting with the bass part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 and 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So make sure here in the third quarter we're keeping the tuning nice and bright. It's all very close together and compact, and when you come down onto the G sharp, that still needs to feel very, very bright and high in the voice. Make sure as well that the A's, when they're repeated, 10 and 9, 8, 7. You're just sort of refreshing the tuning there rather than letting it sag. So now on to the tenor part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 and 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the tricky moment there is just the leap upwards at the end of the chant, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, you want to make sure you're really right on top of that, not straining up at it. Give yourself plenty of time to prepare it. Use the consonants to help you do that. For example, in 26, we bless you from the house of the Lord. So I'm using the time to pronounce the H as time to change my vocal mechanisms and sort of reshape my singing so that I'm in that slightly higher, floatier head part of the voice. Finally, the alto part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So again, a fair few repeated notes in the alto line there. First and third quarters, not the most interesting alto line, for which apologies. But again, make sure that you're refreshing the tuning each time that you sing the notes. Now let's hear all of those parts together, and then we'll look at the text of this second half of the psalm and work out what we're going to do with it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now we need to consider the same sorts of things with text and interpretation as we did in the first half of the psalm. So beginning at verse 25, when we come back in after the playover, we're going to start this second half a little bit more gently, a mezzo piano sort of level for the first two verses there. In both halves of 25, we're going to lengthen the word Lord to indicate the comma. I don't think we need to do anything with the comma that comes after the first word there. I think it would break it up too much. And really the emphasis between those two should be on the word Lord. At the end of verse 25, be careful not to rush the last few syllables there. Some choirs have a tendency to do that, to get to the end of the quarter and say the remaining syllables very quickly. But that's kind of out of keeping with the approach that we're trying to take here, which is gentle and unhurried. In verse 26, the word blessed is 2 syllables, and we need to be quite careful of the pointing in the second half there. There's quite a lot to consider, so just study that really carefully before you try and sing it. In verse 27, after the semicolon at the start of the verse, I think that is a time where we want to indicate punctuation with a breath. It's a little bit more definitive in this instance. It separates the two clauses that verse is presenting a little bit more clearly. And as it's a bit more definitive, we can also bring the dynamics back up a little bit again. We're going to come back up to forte in verse 29, but we don't want to make that jump all in one go. So let's find the middle ground of mezzo forte in verse 27. Because there's an odd number of verses in the psalm that we're singing, we need to add another second half verse in at the end in order to finish the psalm at the end of the chant. So verse 29, although we would normally go back and sing from the beginning of the chant, we're just going to go back to the halfway point and sing it to the second half of the chant. Then the Gloria, when that comes, will be to the full chant, as is customary. We're going to slow down just towards the end of verse 29 to mark the end of the psalm, and we're also going to slow down at the end of the Gloria to mark the end of that as well. Part of the slowdown in the Gloria can be achieved by a breath after ever. That just gives us a little bit more space and pulls out the ending a little bit more. And so again, here's the marked up version of the score, as well as the similar things to the first half. We've got the writ marked in at verse 29 and the end of the Gloria, and breaths in verse 27 and the second half of the Gloria marked with asterisks. So we're at the stage now of being ready to sing this psalm and perform it together. We've looked through, obviously, the music, which is fairly straightforward, and we've gone through the text in some detail. Do take the time to familiarise yourself with the rest of the text, as well as the parts that we've sort of explicitly looked at, so that you're familiar with the whole. One of the challenges of psalm singing is that there's lots of different things to be thinking about, even more so when we sing a hymn, because we're trying to stay together as a group when we sing this, but we don't have a sort of steady beat or pulse to help us to do that. We're relying on speech, rhythms, and how we communicate and engage with each other as singers. So this time as we perform, you're going to have me on half of the screen singing. I think it's the tenor part. I've recorded the video of me singing as well as the audio. And what I'll be trying to do is sort of bring you along with me in the way that I use my body language and facial expressions, how I breathe, how I set myself up for the next phrase or half of a verse or whatever. If you're able to do this in a group, then that would be great. It's a really good test of musicality psalm singing, I find. So if there are multiple singers in your house during the lockdown, then get them all together and have a go singing the psalm together. So here it is. Remember that both chants will be played over before we start singing them, and remember all of the directions and markings and so on that we've gone through during the course of the video. I'll put the marked version of the score up on the screen rather than the unmarked version, so that you don't have to try and remember everything. And as always with psalm singing, focus primarily on the narration and the communication of the text. Here we go.
Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Let Israel now proclaim, his mercy endures forever. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter through it. I will give thanks to you, for you have answered me, and have become my salvation. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we pray. Come, Lord, send us now prosperity. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God. He has given us light. Link the pilgrims with cords right to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will thank you. You are my God, and I will exalt you. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be forever. Amen.
Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you appreciated the slightly different challenge of psalm singing rather than hymn singing. Apologies that the video is coming a bit later than I'd intended. Originally I'd envisaged putting these videos up on a Thursday evening because that's when my usual choir practice is, but yesterday technical difficulties prevented me from doing that. I'm not entirely sure why, because I'm using exactly the same setup as I was last week, but the camera software on my laptop is behaving very strangely, and it might take me a while to figure out why. As well, with the way that the rest of my workload is working out in this completely ridiculous time that we're living in, I think Fridays are going to be more feasible for me than Thursdays. So future videos will also be up on Friday evenings rather than Thursdays. Anyway, that's all for this week. Please do like and share the video, subscribe to the channel. If you don't have a YouTube account, then you can now subscribe via my website to get email notifications when I post a new video, there's a link to that in the description. So until next week, keep well, take care, and I look forward to seeing you again.